It was supposed to be just another committee session in Washington, D.C., a quiet afternoon on Capitol Hill, focused on educational policy. Nothing fancy, nothing emotional, until the moment the silence broke like a snapped wire. I propose that we ask Mr. George Soros to release the full documentation of his academic credentials so that the American people can fairly assess the qualifications of those influencing public policy. The voice was calm, steady, and cold. Robin Roberts, a respected television journalist turned education reform advocate, sat across the long oak table from George Soros. Her words fell like a stone into still water. No one laughed, no one flinched. Cameras turned, pens froze in midair. The air in the room thickened. George didn't move. No defense, no twitch, no panic. He closed his notebook slowly, lifted his gaze, and looked her right in the eye. Not angry, not surprised, just clear. There was a stillness in that look, the kind of stillness that people mistake for silence until it becomes something far louder. Robin didn't blink either. She spoke again, her voice still soft but cutting. This is not personal. I've had to account for my own academic history many times, especially being a black woman in media. Standards should be universal. Some heads nodded, some frowned, others scribbled furiously into notepads. The C-SPAN cameras zoomed in. Still, Soros remained silent, his hands folded in front of him, his body language unshaken. There's a certain kind of strength that does not shout, and in that moment you could feel it. Have you ever been judged more for where you're from than what you've done? Drop your story in the comments. We're listening. And if you believe that truth doesn't always need to be loud to be heard, subscribe. There's more than one way to change the world. That day's session wasn't meant for national broadcast. It was framed as a quiet policy discussion on educational access and academic equity, hosted by the Senate Committee on Higher Education. George Soros, now well into his 90s, had been invited as a guest speaker due to his philanthropic work in education and social justice. Robin Roberts, on the other hand, was there as a critical voice, one who had long questioned the privileges baked into the system. They knew each other. Once, years ago, they'd sat across from each other in a PACE panel titled Merit or Momentum? Who Deserves the Future? That night, George had spoken of hardship and survival, of escaping fascism, of studying at LSE, of building his future from ashes. Robin had replied not with sympathy, but precision. I wasn't born with open doors either, but I never used my scars to demand applause. And so even then they had stood symbolically on opposite ends of the same question, merit or circumstance. Today it was not rage or shouting that drew the crowd in. It was the slow, strategic interplay of unspoken tensions. Robin had entered the room with practiced posture. George was already seated. He did not look up. But everyone in that chamber could feel the tension coil between them like electric wire. In the audience, professors, policy analysts, students, and more press than the topic usually warranted. But the names on the guest list, George Soros and Robin Roberts, changed everything. Robin began speaking first, calm, deliberate. I believe in merit, but I do not believe in rewriting standards to meet quotas. When diversity becomes more important than quality, we lose integrity. Some clapped silently, others nodded. A few pursed their lips. George did not interrupt. And when his turn came, he did not rush. He adjusted his glasses, moved his pen aside, and with a voice that was steady but solemn, he said, I support inclusion, and I support truth. And the truth is, some people had to climb twice as far just to be seen as average. He paused, then continued. The real injustice is not the admissions system. It's the assumption that we don't belong. Nobody said her name, but everyone knew. Those words were for Robin. A young intern whispered to his colleague, where exactly did he graduate from? Oxford or LSE? A journalist opened his laptop and began typing furiously. The search returned more than he expected. Top honors at the London School of Economics, fellowship at Oxford, a research chair in comparative constitutional law, dozens of honorary degrees, Global Human Rights Medal. The Washington Post had once summarized him as the man who silences governments without raising his voice. But less known was something else, that Robin Roberts had quietly taken 2 years off during her graduate program, for personal reasons. The press never questioned it. After all, she was the underdog, the self-made woman, the American story. Nobody said it, but you could feel it. Who gets examined and who gets excused? Robin leaned forward again, calm, unbothered, but her eyes scanning. George didn't blink. A political columnist near the back turned to his partner and whispered, "This isn't policy. This is chess." And just like that, the first move had been made. The tension didn't break. It stretched, tight as wire, silent as snowfall. Every breath in the chamber felt measured. No one interrupted. No one dared. Then Robin Roberts leaned back slightly, glanced at the committee chair, and calmly placed a single sheet of paper on the table. She slid it forward with 2 fingers. "I'd like to enter this into the record," she said. The camera zoomed in. Some reporters stood up from their chairs. "This is an anonymous post from the Educare Leaks platform," she continued. "It's a place where former professors and academic staff have privately shared concerns about public figures. In this case, one professor questions the legitimacy of Mr. Soros's final degree process, specifically whether special accommodations were made." A low ripple of murmurs traveled through the chamber. Soros didn't speak, didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly to read the paper from where he sat. A senator raised her hand. "Ms. Roberts, is this a verified source?" Robin nodded faintly. "No, Senator, I'm not claiming verification, but I do believe it's worth consideration, especially if we're talking about integrity and equal standards." The room went still again. The weight of that word, integrity, hung thick. All eyes turned to George Soros. The C-SPAN camera zoomed closer than ever, capturing his hands. Still, relaxed, resting on his notebook. Then, with the slightest movement, he flipped the page. The sound of paper seemed to echo, and with a voice that neither trembled nor thundered, he said, "Ms. Roberts, what exactly would you like me to prove? A grade, a transcript, or the sum of my life?" Nobody applauded, nobody laughed, but something cracked. The chamber no longer felt like a hearing room. It felt like a mirror held up to the nation's face. Robin didn't back down. She kept her eyes on him. "If I was ever asked about my education," she said, "I always answered. Those who dodge simple questions usually have something to hide." Some nodded, others shifted in their seats. A man near the back whispered, "She's not wrong." The room now felt physically divided. The right side of the chamber leaned toward Robin, the left toward George. Journalists scribbled like their pens might catch fire. Still, Soros said nothing more. He didn't need to, because just then, like a glitch in the script, a young man in the third row stood up. He wore a cheap blazer, a student badge pinned to his chest. Guest attendee. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the silence. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm a first-year law student at Howard University. I wasn't planning to speak today. But if academic merit is the measure of political virtue, then why are there so many brilliant people in power passing laws that hurt the vulnerable?" The room froze. Not a breath, not a cough, just stillness. Robin turned toward him, eyes unreadable. George Soros looked down at the table, then back up. But he said nothing, because that question didn't belong to one person. It belonged to everyone in that room. And for the first time in the hearing, doubt rippled across the faces of those who had been so certain just minutes ago. The student sat back down. His hands trembled. A woman in the third row whispered to her neighbor, "That kid just asked what no one else dared to." And quietly the energy shifted. Robin Roberts tried to respond, but the edge in her voice had dulled. "I only asked for the same transparency I've always lived by," she said. But the sentence didn't land. The room had changed. Because suddenly this didn't feel like a fight between two political figures. It felt like something bigger. Have you ever watched people question someone's worth based on where they're from? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your story. And if you believe silence sometimes speaks louder than accusation, don't forget to subscribe. As the session resumed, cameras began focusing more on Soros. His expression hadn't changed, but the narrative had. It was no longer about a degree. It was about what people assumed behind the degree. And George Soros, without ever raising his voice, had made everyone ask themselves one quiet, unsettling question. Who do we really demand explanations from and why? Then came a moment no one had prepared for. A staffer from the committee, young, sharp-suited, clearly startled, hurried toward Chairwoman Margaret Whitmore, whispered something into her ear, and slid a folded note into her hand. She paused. Her face changed. Neutrality gave way to subtle surprise. She tapped the microphone. We've just been informed that an unregistered guest has stepped forward, offering relevant testimony tied directly to the subject raised by Ms. Roberts. Heads turned, eyebrows raised. Chairwoman Whitmore glanced down at the note again. The name is Professor Dr. Elijah Hart, former Dean of Law at Columbia University. The oxygen seemed to leave the room. Soros didn't move. Robin Roberts shifted slightly in her chair. Somewhere, a journalist dropped his pen. Then, a presence. From the back of the room, a tall man emerged, slender, silver-haired, steady. His coat was long, dark, and old-fashioned. In one hand, he carried a narrow leather folder. In the other, a wooden cane carved with patterns no one recognized. He didn't need an introduction. His presence was enough. Dr. Hart walked slowly to the center of the room. He did not reach for the microphone. He didn't need it. His voice was deep, full, calm like ocean weight. I apologize for not registering, but I came here today not as a dean, not as a scholar. I came as a witness because I taught both Mr. Soros and Ms. Roberts. Even Robin couldn't hide her surprise. Hart opened into the folder. From it, he lifted a single antique-looking sheet preserved in a protective sleeve. This is not a transcript, he said. I didn't bring that. He held the page up gently. This is a copy of Mr. Soros's thesis, Quality in Law, Inequality in Practice, Structural Barriers in American Civil Litigation. Awarded in 1962 with the Eisenhower Prize for Academic Contribution to Justice Reform. The room went still. This thesis, Hart continued, was written during the final months of Mr. Soros's father's battle with cancer. I remember it because I received the extension request myself. He paused, but he declined the extension. He said, if I can't write this while it hurts, then how will I ever fight for people who are hurting? Far back in the audience, someone began to cry. Soft, muffled sobs. A student wiped her eyes. Even seasoned reporters turned away to blink. Robin's lips parted, but she said nothing. George Soros looked down, then slowly closed his notebook. Dr. Hart turned, his gaze shifting across the room. Then he looked directly at Robin. I also taught you, he said gently, and I made arrangements when you needed time. Your family had to leave the country. You were under personal stress. I offered a semester's delay. He held her gaze. I don't say this to shame anyone. I say this because today we're weighing truth. And truth, he said, his voice hardening, is not something we measure in bullet points. It is something we live through. And some people live it quietly. A long pause, then the blow. I oversaw both of you, he said, but only one ever used personal circumstances as a reason for delay. And that one was not George Soros. Gasps, no objections, no protests, just silence. Soros remained seated, his face composed but not triumphant. Robin sat frozen, her jaw locked, her eyes unreadable. The air in the chamber thickened again, but this time not with tension, with clarity. This was no longer a hearing, this was a reckoning. And suddenly, all those carefully prepared arguments about fairness, merit, and degrees felt paper thin. Have you ever seen someone stay silent, not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to let truth do the talking? Tell us below, your story matters here. And if you believe dignity can be louder than debate, make sure you're subscribed, because some stories only come once. Professor Hart didn't stay long at the center of the room. He didn't grandstand, he didn't wait for applause. He placed the thesis gently on the committee table, nodded once toward George Soros, and turned to leave. But just as he reached the edge of the chamber, he stopped, turned back, faced Chairwoman Whitmore, and said in a voice that carried without needing volume, "I don't want to end with a sentence. I think I should tell the part people rarely ask about." Heads lifted. Even Robin Roberts, rigid moments ago, now looked slightly uneasy. Dr. Hart did not look at her. He didn't even look at Soros. He looked straight ahead, like a man who's seen history up close and knows exactly where its fault lines run. "It was the spring semester of 1962, he began. "I received 2 letters just days apart. The first was from a final-year student named George Soros. It was long, handwritten. He explained that he was under family pressure, that he was sleeping poorly, that he was dealing with symptoms we now recognize as mild depression. He asked for understanding. A hush fell. No movement, not a single sound. I replied. I told him to take a semester off, that it was okay." Hart pulled out another document, yellowed with time. "This is that letter. I kept it. I kept it because sometimes mercy is more important than measurement." He paused, then held up a second document. "And this is from the same week, this time from Ms. Roberts. Her mother had just entered the ICU. It was the 3rd round of chemo. But her letter wasn't a request for delay. It was a promise that no matter how hard it got, her work would arrive on time." The committee sat frozen. She handed in her dissertation on the day of the deadline. Pale, eyes red, no excuse, no explanation. He looked up. Not a word about her mother. Now even Robin's breath caught in her throat. She didn't move. She didn't protest. Because there was nothing to refute. This wasn't a defense. It was history, laid bare. And for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, even the most cynical observers felt something shift. Not an opinion, but an understanding. An older congressman leaned toward his aide and whispered, "No one ever told us that." A journalist stopped typing mid-sentence and simply stared. And somewhere in the back row, a teacher quietly said, "We've been asking the wrong questions all along." Because suddenly it wasn't about GPA or quotas or anonymous blog posts. It was about effort. It was about silence. It was about the difference between asking for sympathy and simply surviving. Have you ever carried your pain quietly just to prove you were enough? Share it below. We read every comment, and if you believe some truths deserve more than a soundbite, subscribe. You're exactly the reason we tell these stories. At the center of the room, George Soros hadn't moved. He was still holding the blue pen, still looking at the page in front of him. But now the cameras had shifted again. No longer focused on his degree or Robin's question, but on the space between them, on what had never been said. And in that space, the loudest voice was silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. The hearing room no longer resembled a political forum. It felt more like a confessional, a quiet, dignified reckoning. George Soros sat motionless. His fingers gently traced the edge of the paper in front of him. His thesis, now worn with time, but never with meaning. Robin Roberts, once sharp and poised, now looked downward. Her posture hadn't changed, but the room had, and everyone could feel it. One camera zoomed in, slowly capturing the moment her eyes blinked just a second longer than normal. No tears, just stillness, a quiet surrender, not to defeat, but to reality. And then came a whisper from the gallery, a name softly spoken, Marzia. An older woman, former law student, known in circles but never in headlines, turned to the person beside her and said, almost to herself, she was there, every morning, 6 a.m. In the library, I thought it was ambition. I never knew her mother was in the hospital. Those around her heard. The words passed from one ear to the next, like an invisible ripple. By the time it reached the journalist, the narrative had already changed. Soros never looked up. He didn't need to. Because at that moment, the weight of years of sacrifice, silence, struggle, spoke without needing sound. Professor Hart, still standing quietly near the exit, turned one last time. His voice, more tender now, filled the air. Wisdom, he said, has nothing to do with where you come from. It's about what you pass on, even when you barely have the strength left to carry it yourself. No one applauded, no one had to. Because something had broken, but not in the way that wounds, in the way that frees. Have you ever realized that the strongest people in the room, were the ones who never said a word. Drop a comment. Tell us who they were. They deserve to be remembered. And if you believe dignity is the loudest answer, hit that subscribe button. We're not here for noise. We're here for truth. That day, something irreversible happened. Not to policy, not to law, but to perception. It didn't matter anymore how Soros had gotten his degrees. It didn't matter what Roberts had hinted at or how sharp her questions had once been. The only thing that lingered was the silence he had wrapped himself in, and the overwhelming realization that some stories aren't told because they're carried. That's when Soros finally moved. He stood, not to defend himself, not to argue. He simply picked up his thesis, folded it back into its protective sleeve, and held it in his lap like a memory, soft and old and heavy with truth. He didn't look for cameras. He didn't wait for applause. He just waited, and the world listened. Within hours, the world had already seen it. Clips from the hearing spread like wildfire, but it wasn't the sharp exchange that went viral. It wasn't Robin's pointed challenge. It wasn't Professor Hart's dramatic testimony. It was a photograph. A single, unfiltered image. George Soros, seated at the end of the long committee table, his head slightly bowed, his hand resting gently on his thesis, sunlight pouring through the window behind him. No caption, no tagline, just the moment. And somehow, everyone understood. The image was shared across platforms, millions of times. Underneath, people wrote things like, "Not everyone speaks, but everyone deserves to be heard." This isn't about politics. It's about humanity. News anchors tried to catch up. Talk shows extended invitations. Podcasts speculated on what Soros would say next. He declined all of them. Instead, 2 days later, he posted a single sentence on X. Not everyone in the same class learns the same lesson. No hashtag, no photo, no logo, just words. And because of that, those words echoed louder than any interview could. At universities across the country, from Berkeley to Boston, law students began to gather after lectures, not to argue grades, but to ask better questions. What is success? Who gets believed? Why do some need to prove more just to be seen as equal? A professor at NYU stood before his class and said quietly, "Perhaps the greatest education we can offer is to teach our students how to stay silent when silence is stronger than shouting." George Soros never commented further, but his silence kept teaching. And Robin Roberts? She disappeared from public view for a while. No statements, no rebuttals. Some criticized her, others defended her. But even those who once applauded her sharpness now look back at the hearing and said, maybe we were all too quick to assume who the strong one was. Have you ever witnessed someone's silence become their greatest defense? Let us know in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe some stories don't need music, edits, or applause, just truth, subscribe. Because stories like this, they're why we're here. Back in Washington, Chairwoman Whitmore closed the hearing without fanfare. She said only one sentence. Let the record show that silence can carry more than testimony. And no one objected, because in that room, no one needed to be loud to be heard. 2 weeks passed, the city moved on, headlines shifted, debates turned elsewhere. But that moment in Washington, that day of unspoken truths and steady hands, it didn't vanish, it settled, like a seed buried deep. At law schools, students began requesting discussions not just on justice, but on bias, compassion, silence. One university renamed a scholarship, not after a politician, but after a phrase, the lesson not everyone learns. And in classrooms across America, something subtle began to change. Professors who once demanded loudness began to notice the quiet students, the ones who never spoke unless it mattered, the ones who carried more than they showed. Robin Roberts returned to television months later. She opened her show with a rare admission. Sometimes the questions we ask say more about us than the answers we demand. She didn't name George Soros. She didn't need to, because by then he wasn't just the man in the story, he had become the story. Not for his wealth, not for his power, but because, in the middle of a world that rewards noise, he chose silence, and that silence turned out to be the loudest truth anyone had heard in years. George never made a statement. He didn't write a memoir. He never appeared on camera again. But once, while visiting a small university in Ohio, he left a handwritten note on a student bulletin board. It said, "You don't have to raise your voice to be remembered. You just have to stand for something when no one else will." No one saw him write it. No one saw him leave. But the message remained, and the pen he used, still pinned behind the glass under a small plaque. For the ones who never shouted, but were always heard. Have you ever seen someone walk away from the spotlight and still leave a legacy behind? Tell us in the comments. And if this story touched something deep inside you, don't scroll past, subscribe, because not every voice is loud, but some echo forever.